My name is Roxanne Backowski. I'm an Electronic Resources Management Librarian at the University of Wisconsin-Eau, and my co-presenter, Tim Morton, will introduce himself later. We're very happy that you're here today to listen to our presentation. If you attended one of the keynote sessions yesterday, Lord Condemsey said this: library excellence should be determined by the context of strategic fit to our university interests. And when Tim and I both heard that, we said, oh, that's kind of the common thread between our two parts of the presentation, but also in relation to library assessment projects and collection diversity. So I'm going to talk first about my example from the University of Wisconsin-Eau, and then Tim's going to take the second half of the presentation. We'll take questions at the end, and please use the microphone for questions. This session is being recorded, so everyone here can hear you, and then the recording, they can also hear your questions. Okay, let's get started here. The University of Wisconsin-Eau, where I work, is a public liberal arts regional comprehensive university in western Wisconsin with approximately 10,000 FTE. I'm an early career librarian and researcher, and I say that because I'm here looking for research partners. We need to make sure our collections represent diverse voices, our user populations, marginalized communities, and populations. I think evaluation of our collections for diversity is important, and I think our profession more strongly values this as well. I'm appreciative of the presentation last year from Charleston about putting our values into action. I believe there's another session later today at 1 o'clock that touches on some of the same themes that Tim and I are talking about. So I'm appreciative of that work surrounding this topic, and I'd like to see the conversation continue. I'm here to talk about a library assessment project about campus diversity initiatives and their impact on library collections. My part of the presentation is not going to discuss how to bring diversity into collection building, and it does not answer the question, is our collection diverse? It seeks to explore if our collection is serving the teaching and learning needs, as well as the strategic goals and values at the University of Wisconsin-Eau. FYI, I'll be using EDI as an acronym for equity, diversity, and inclusivity. That's always a mouthful. It's easier for me to do that, and we have limited time here. A quick overview of my part of the presentation. I'm going to introduce the two campus diversity initiatives at the University of Wisconsin-Eau, talk about the research methods I used in my project, results from the project itself, and then some discussion and conclusions, and then I'll turn it over to Tim. And I forgot to move to my introductory slide. So let's talk about the two campus diversity initiatives at the University of Wisconsin-Eau. The first one, implemented in the 2016-2017 academic year, was new liberal education curriculum requirements. This replaced our general education program. And what was unique about it, that there were two learning outcomes that directly relate to EDI. For example, one of those was use critical and analytical skills to evaluate assumptions and challenge existing structures in ways that respect diversity and foster equity and inclusivity. So the first campus diversity initiative was related to liberal education changes on our campus. The second, a personnel measure went into effect in 2018. All reviews of employees at the University of Wisconsin-Eau include an evaluation of a faculty or staff member's EDI engagement. Contributions can be demonstrated through teaching, curricular development, scholarly activity, engagement in initiatives that directly serve underrepresented populations and communities, and professional development. Then my research project, as an e-resources librarian, I happened to be looking at our ProQuest eBook Central usage, and you're not meant to be able to read the titles here, that's not important, but I was looking at the top 20 titles for 2 different years. The first year on the left is from 2014-2015, and then 3 years later on the right is 2017-2018. And what I have highlighted here are titles within the top 20 that I saw related to EDI, or titles that could be used in an EDI context. And from left to right, you'll see the number on the left was 3. It ballooned 3 years later to 12 titles. And just seeing this as a snapshot started some questions in my mind. I was wondering if faculty were changing their curricular choices, if that was impacting our ebook usage, and how these campus diversity initiatives factored into that. This led me to my research question. Are University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire instructors changing the required materials they assign to students as a result of the 2 campus diversity initiatives, and what is the impact on library ebook collections? This table is from the 2010 article Diversity Collection Assessment in Large Academic Libraries. The scope of assessment methods I used for my project were user-centered. Circulation use stats, I used ebook stats, and then I did a focus group and a survey. I used a mixed method approach between quantitative and qualitative, so I just would like to reiterate here that this project that I did was not a collection-centered diversity project. It's not answering the question, is our collection diverse? How can we change our collection development policies? That's important, but I wanted to move beyond kind of the library-centric internal assessment project and get to the wider campus, what's impacting the use of our library collections, and what are our values on campus? How can this be potentially show some assessment for the larger campus? Now on to the research methods. First one was a survey. The audience for the survey was faculty, instructional academic staff, adjunct faculty, anyone who taught, and was designed to elicit a large number of responses about curricular choices and the reading materials they assigned, so required reading materials, to students. It also included content about the identification process for selecting readings and how the library is incorporated into that process. The survey was short. It had 12 questions, less than 5 minutes to complete. I received 84 responses, which was a 15% response rate. 2 questions specifically I asked on the survey, well, 3 really, were related to the campus diversity initiatives. One about the personnel measure and then one about the liberal education. And I asked this, I first explained, this happened in 2018, the personnel measure, and then did you adapt or develop a course as a result of this personnel measure, yes or no? I asked that same question for the liberal education curriculum changes, and then if one person said yes to either or both of those, they got this next question. If yes, when you adapted or developed a course, did you incorporate reading materials related to EDI or social responsibility? And they were prompted to say to what extent they did. Survey participants were allowed to, or could volunteer for the focus group. And I had 13 volunteers, 6 attended from various departments on my campus. The questions for the focus group were meant to go into depth about the process of selecting, identifying, and assigning course readings, and what the library could do to make it easier to assign these course readings. Most of this nuance couldn't be gathered from the survey. And then the last method, the quantitative and the ebook stats. I looked at Counter Release 4, Book Report 2. I looked at 3 academic years worth of usage, and I looked at 5 vendor or publishers reports, EBSCO, ProQuest, ACLS Humanities, JSTOR, and Project Muse. And my goal with looking at this ebook usage was I was trying to determine the rate of use of ebook titles related to EDI over 3 years to see if there was a change in that rate of use. I gave a yes-no determination based on the title for anything that could be used in an EDI context. That equated to about 12,000 titles total that I gave that yes-no coding to. And the criteria used is this: content about a non-dominant culture, content about identities, content about intercultural and interpersonal communication, social scientific literature, and professional development material. A major limitation of this part of the project is that I was the only person coding this data. As a white, cisgendered female, I acknowledge that my privilege and biases are likely to show in this. Now, moving on to results. First, with the survey. I asked a question about when preparing to teach a course again, how much content or reading materials are swapped or added. Up to 75% of respondents to this question said they switch out up to a quarter of the content. And I say up to 75% because we failed to include an option for no change. And we confirmed in the focus group that there is sometimes when preparing to teach a class again, instructors don't change course materials. So that's included, but some also change up to half readings and some change more than half. In addition to that, we learned that 75% of respondents are more likely to include content as a course reading if the library provides it electronically. And then, I didn't show that, I'm sorry. Oh, this is the next one. Okay, so this is in relation to the questions about the personnel measure and the liberal education curriculum changes, and then the question, when you adapted or developed a course, to what extent did you incorporate reading materials related to EDI? 75% of respondents to this question said they increased the amount of reading material related to EDI or social responsibility. The other 25% kept it the same. No one said they decreased it, but either they stayed the same or they were increasing the amount of content related to EDI in their new courses, in their adapted courses as a result of those campus diversity initiatives. The focus group, I'd like to share some quotes from that. When we were asking questions about choosing course content and selecting it, one person said this: "Whose voices do I need to incorporate into my courses? EDI trainings over the past year have helped me realize I need more diversity, women and people of color." So that speaks to curricular choices, the training that's happening on our campus related to EDI, and changing the course as a result. Another instructor said this: "The library ordered a video about Native boarding school trauma. Students hearing voices about people of color helps promote familiarity and comfort. It helps humanize the voices of Native people." And this one, it's interesting because it talks about format. We weren't asking about video necessarily, we were talking about reading materials, but they were allowed to speak about any types of curricular choices that they made. And it's interesting, the video and the reasoning that the instructor chooses the video, and then also they particularly said the library ordered this video and I used it in my class and here's why I use it and here is what it does. So those were illuminating to us. Lastly, results of the ebook usage. The rate of use of EDI-related ebook titles over 3 years increased slightly, from 17% to 19%. Looking at each vendor individually, I had 2 that increased, 2 that decreased, and 1 that stayed the same. EBSCO was flat, JSTOR and ProQuest decreased, and ACLS, Humanities, and Project Muse increased. And I haven't ascribed a lot of meaning to this because I don't necessarily think it's based on the vendor. It could be based on the content that was being provided, whether we were doing active collection development or not, but I wasn't ascribing a lot of meaning to individual vendors, which is why initially I shared the overall percentage. Okay, in discussion and some conclusions here. I found that the counter release 4 ebook usage stats are inadequate to make conclusions. If anyone was in the counter session yesterday, they said counter doesn't interpret the intent of users. And I would push back on that a little bit because I could tell if there are 6,000 downloads from the book The Late Homecomer by Kaukulia Yang, that's pretty likely that it's being downloaded by a bunch of students and is being used in class. And in fact, we do know that on our campus that an instructor is using that text to make for their curriculum. On the other hand, when there's 1, 2, or 5 uses, we don't know if it's a student researching on that topic, if it's an instructor grabbing the PDF and sharing it with their class in the learning management system. So it is very difficult to ascribe meaning to the ebook stats. And unless there maybe would have been a ginormous increase, then we could say, yes, there is more conclusions based on the ebook usage stats, but here, mostly inconclusive. On the flip side, the qualitative methods in this research produced more meaningful results. I know there are instructors who are responding to campus diversity initiatives. They're changing their curricular materials they assign to students, and they're adding more content related to EDI. I know this from the survey and the focus group. I know that the library providing access to electronic content increases the likelihood instructors will assign it to students. And as far as this being an assessment measure for campus, I can share these conclusions with our Center for Teaching and Learning, which is our faculty professional development. They also administer our EDI training, and share these with them, as well as McIntyre Library could use this to communicate our value. Lurkin Dempsey said also yesterday, libraries are looking to provide value in the context of the institution, and our institution has made clear commitments to EDI in our strategic goals and values. Forgot to move to there as well, but I just want to say, since the 2010 article about diversity collection assessment in large academic libraries, the sophistication of our assessment practices has increased. We're not just counting hashtags, numbers, we're trying to figure out how and why our collections are serving our institutions. Especially if your collection development policy emphasizes curricular needs, especially if you're responding to ever-expanding diverse requests, we need to know our content is serving our campus's learning needs and strategic goals. I'll leave you with a couple questions to consider. Think about policies, curricular changes, new initiatives, or strategic goals related to EDI that have been implemented at your campus in recent years. Do you suspect they've had an impact on library collection use, and to what extent? Where can you find evidence of this? And how can this work not only inform our internal collection building practices, but the larger goals of our institutions? Thank you. I'll switch it over to Tim now.
Good morning, my name is Tim Morton. I'm the manager of resource acquisition and description at the University of Virginia Library, and I'm going to be taking a little bit deeper dive into the actual characteristics of our collection as they pertain to institutional issues of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. So how well, given initiatives at the University of Virginia, what does our collection look like today, and what are the implications for where we need to move in the future? And the framing device I've chosen for that is the Own Voices hashtag, which was created a little over 4 years ago. And you can see, it's created to recommend kid lit about diverse characters written by authors from that same diverse group. And the author goes on to say, it's not to discourage people from writing outside their own experiences, it's to lift up those who are often ignored. So the theory here being, if you're buying literature featuring LGBT characters, have that be written by an LGBT author. If you're buying literature about Latinx characters, have that be written by a Latinx author from their own experience, from their own background. And public libraries have really latched on to this, and you can see, she frames it in terms of kid lit, but it's particularly in the public library sphere been expanded to all forms of literature, all forms of their collections. And the collection development team at UVA, we've been wondering, well, how does that apply? How can we take that idea and transfer it to the academic library environment? Because academics would like to say, oh, we are objective in how we are studying the world. We're objective in our different areas. So my background doesn't matter because I'm an objective historian or an objective sociologist. And we know that that's not how the world works. And there are also different library contexts between a public library and an academic library. So, for instance, at the University of Virginia, we have literally millions of items from across the centuries, from around the world, written on every subject at every intellectual level, from children's books all the way up, versus a public library where, even a very large public library is going to have a much more limited scope than that academic setting. As a consequence of that broad collection scope, we have hundreds of thousands of authors in our collection, versus in a public library, if you're very heavily fiction, a fiction-based collection, there's a much smaller world of children's literature authors, regular fiction authors, And one thing that those groups also do a much better job of than our faculty is self-promotion. You can find out information about particularly children's literature authors relatively easy. There are lots of broad reference resources to give you that information about those authors, whereas for a lot of our academic authors, they may have even died 50 years ago. We have no idea who they are, and we'd rather not look at their name and say, oh, well, I know what he or she is. I know his or her background just based on her name, or even worse, based on a picture in the back of their book. We'd rather have something a little bit more robust. And then finally, there's a real synergy between the concept of own voices and the public library's reader advisory mission, where if you like this book, here are other very similar things written from a minority viewpoint by a minority author that give you new things to consider and new things to learn about. In the academic environment, you'll often have a faculty member say, I want this book on this subject by this person. You're not going to get a whole lot of success by saying, well, if you're interested in this other subject over here is kind of related and is by somebody who you might not know and might not have any sort of affiliation with. That might be a good goal, but whether or not that will be received, particularly by our faculty members, is another story. And so, given that lack of scalable at the size of an R1 institution information about our authors, how can we use that own voices idea to evaluate our collections? And what we wanted to ask ourselves was, can we use place of publication as a proxy to estimate the prevalence of own voices material in our collection? The thinking here being the intense competition in academic publishing in Western Europe and the Americas is such that if you're a historian writing about, and we're going to be talking about Africa, so if you're a historian writing about Congolese history, you're going to be trying to publish with Oxford University Press. You're going to be trying to publish in the major Western publishers. You're not generally going to be publishing that book in Africa. On the flip side, you might have a Congolese historian writing a book on Congolese history. They may really want to publish in those major Western publishers, and there can often be systemic issues why that can't happen. And so if you end up publishing in the developing world, our thinking is you are much more likely to be from that cultural and that context. And as we're looking at place of publication in our collection, we're also asking what other insights can we get about our collections. So I mentioned we are starting with African Studies at the UVA Library, and the reason for that is there's a lot going on with UVA with regard to African and African American studies. So we have an institute that's being bumped up to a full-fledged department, able to offer bachelor's up through PhD degrees. That's a brand new initiative. The library is also hiring a subject liaison to support that area. And then other academic departments have hired faculty with a convergent focus on Africa. So, Africa and art, Africa and music, Africa and politics, rather than just, what you might expect, African history. And then, frankly, both Charlottesville and UVA have some difficult legacies on the issue of race and African American and African studies. And we thought this would be a good way to help the library, and by extension the broader community, think through what is the role that academia has played in that history and in changing that history moving forward. So I went through the entire LC classification tables, which was a lot of fun. I found every single reference I could to Africa as a whole or individual African countries, and found 137 different call number classes and subclasses, and running those through our catalog, identified just over 54,000 monographs in our collection. And you can see we pulled a lot of different data points from our catalog, and then created some derived data points as well. So we had place of publication. I went through all 54,000, rolled those up and standardized them to country. And then I took those countries, rolled them up into the geographic region, took all those regions, rolled them up into a publication continent. Also, I took call number and turned that into something that, unless you're a cataloger, you may not know at a glance what all the call numbers are, so make it human readable so we can analyze it. And then for those publications from Africa, there's a big historical context of looking at the publication date. Was this published during the colonial period? Was it published post-independence? And then also for those African countries, is there any kind of relationship between the former European colonial power and this country post-independence? And there's kind of some interesting stuff we found there. So there's definitely some limitations in this data, so we were only looking at monographs, so our serials, periodicals, things like that weren't included. Includes all with a heavy asterisk, because I assume I found most of the Africa-related LC classes, but I am positive I missed some because it's just so dense. So we can find everything published about Africa, but the tricky part is finding that's not necessarily going to get you everything published in Africa. So a book published in Africa on general world history or general economics or science or something else that is not specifically tied to Africa, we'd have no way to find it short of exporting all 7 million items, and that's not scalable. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then finally, as you know, there can often be more than one place of publication in a book. So an Oxford University Press book might say New York and London. When those separate places of publication both occurred in the same country, once I've rolled everything up to country, something that was published in New York and Philadelphia, I can dedupe those easily enough. And the remaining titles where there are 2 places of publication in 2 separate countries, it turns out that's actually a pretty small portion of the data set. So the dupes are about 9% of the items, but since there's duplicates, it's actually really only 4.5% of our collection. So what did we find? We were actually surprised. So Africa publications accounted for about a third of our African Studies collection. We had no idea what to expect. We were thinking it was probably going to be fairly low, something in the 10-15% range, but it turns out to be just over a third. We see Europe is the largest publisher of our African Studies content. The Americas is right up there, and then the rest of the world together is pretty much a rounding error as far as African Studies at UVA is concerned. We can see that this collection peaked in the late 80s and early 90s, both in terms of the absolute value of the number of things that we acquired, but then also Africa's share of that collection. So we see the red bar there of Africa. Starting in the second half of the 90s and up to present, that amount has really shrunk down. We can see the brown bar of the Americas, which really we mean the United States, by and large. The United States is now the ones predominantly telling the story of African Studies at UVA. Digging down into the African material specifically, there's kind of 3 roughly equal groups. There's about a third of the stuff coming from the southern portion of Africa, about a third of it coming from northern Africa, and then the rest of the continent across the middle from west central to east Africa kind of cumulatively make up about another third. And interestingly, that peak from the late 80s and early 90s is even more pronounced when we look at only the African materials. And not only is there just a massive drop-off in content, we can also see a shift as to where that content's coming from. So you can see the red bar up until the early 90s, most of it is coming from southern Africa. But since then, what little we still do get is coming pretty exclusively from North Africa. One thing that's interesting for those of you who know African history, so 1994, all of a sudden our acquisitions from Southern Africa just completely drop off the map. I would like to dig into that more and figure out that's when Mandela gets elected, that's the end of the apartheid government. So is the publishing industry just completely disrupted and they're not putting out anything? Did 25 years ago people at UVA say, we're not really interested anymore? I just really want to know the history there. I would like to assume that it's not some sort of cynical decision making, but I have no idea. We can also look at some interesting comparisons between what is published in a country and what is published about a particular country. So I chose Guinea-Bissau here just because it's small and hopefully somewhat legible. But we can see about half the stuff that was published in Guinea-Bissau is about the history of Guinea-Bissau. And that basically goes across every country in Africa. About half of our collection from that country is the history of that country. And so we can also see on the right, well, who else was publishing about the history of Guinea-Bissau? And you can see we've got about 100 books. Half of them are from Portugal. Portugal being the country that Guinea-Bissau became independent from. That also is pretty much universal across our collection. The former European power over, before independence for all these African states are the ones who do the lion's share of the publishing in each of those states.
One other thing we have to think about is, so there are these 7 books published in Guinea-Bissau about the history of Guinea-Bissau. Well, we have to ask, when were those published? Because if they were published prior to the mid-1970s, well, is that really going to be own voices? Is that really going to be an African publication, or is that going to be a European publishing in Guinea-Bissau but telling the story from their perspective? And so there's a lot of historical context that we need to think about as we're trying to answer this question of own voices in African Studies collection. So you can see the red here is items published post-independence, so by an independent state. And the overwhelming portion of our collection actually is from the independence period, with the exception of Lusophone Africa, oddly enough. And there are different reasons that I've talked with folks about that. But aside from that, we actually seem to have a very good, robust collection for them. And there is also kind of a third category for 3 different states. They're independent, but they're also under white rule. And you see, again, for South Africa, 80% of what we have was from that apartheid period. And we could call that own voices content, but it's a very restrictive section of the voices of the country at that time. And so we can talk a little bit about the subjects that we found. So there are several classes where actually the majority of our content comes from Africa when related to African studies. However, some of them are kind of problematic or at least require some nuance from an own voices perspective. So for instance, Afrikaans literature and Afrikaans language, like the majority of that comes from Africa. But again, it's only telling it's speaking through the voices of the Afrikaner community, which is a smaller part of the larger South African community. So how do we actually evaluate that at the end of the day in this framework? Similarly, statistical data, the HAs being just giant statistical yearbooks. A compendium of facts, does that change based on whether or not it's coming from a national statistical agency versus from the United Nations or from some other NGO? And then there's also the fact that those usefulness in academia are kind of in really niche areas. They don't tell a story, it's just a compendium of facts. So does that really even make sense in an own voices framework? There are several subject areas where the African published materials are a plurality of the collection, actually match really well with UVA's academic strengths. So languages and literatures, for instance, or social sciences, so economics and development and things like that. UVA has a strong scholarly commitment to those areas, and our collection in those areas as it pertains to Africa is very much African. On the flip side, there's also several areas where UVA considers this to be one of our areas of scholarly strength, but our collection just doesn't support it at all as it pertains to Africa. So for instance, religion is a strong point of the University of Virginia. And when it comes to religion in Africa, all of those stories are being told by Americans and by Europeans rather than by publications from Africa themselves. So for instance, I want to highlight the Ethiopian church. So we tend to think of Christianity in Africa as missionaries coming in the 19th century, whereas the Ethiopian church has existed for millennia. It's a organic African church, and the several dozen books that we have about the Ethiopian church, there's only one from Africa, and that's not even from Ethiopia. So, in this context, for something that's so important to the University of Virginia, we're not allowing those people to tell their own stories and to write their own history and to present their own points of view. So, the question we asked earlier on, can place of publication act as a reasonable proxy for own voices characteristics? And the answer I know you all came to hear is maybe. So I did a lot more digging into the data that I didn't want to bore everybody with, but as we look at publisher and date and other characteristics, in general, it seems to be that if you were publishing in Africa, it does tend to seem to line up well that you're an African author, an African scholar publishing your own stories. Now, obviously, the date of publication has some big impacts there. Colonial period versus independent period, and occasionally the subjects. We talked about Afrikaans a little bit, and then it turns out a lot of the early African language and linguistics information was
published in Africa, but it was published by Christian missionaries from Europe so that they could translate the Bible into those languages. So again, there are certain subjects and certain time periods where it just doesn't really make that much of an impact. And we should really understand place of publication to be a floor of own voices content rather than any sort of definitive measure. So despite all the competition to publish in major North American or European presses, there will be own voices in those presses. I don't want to completely disparage them. So any measure that I've had here of our African studies, like there will be some measure of those American publications, of those European publications that are published by own voices authors. So this is really a baseline rather than some sort of maximum. So what were the implications of this for the University of Virginia? So obviously there was that big drop off of content 25 years ago. We need to figure out why did that happen, how do we address that? What relationships can we establish with vendors to address that, particularly across the central part of the continent where only a third of our collection is being divided up over such a large portion of the continent. And then particularly, what was the deal with the post-apartheid materials in South Africa, and how do we address that? As we look at the title lists of what's published about each country and in each country, there's a real perceptible bias towards both tragedies and, this might be the history of this country, but we have this book because it really ties in with American interest really well as well. And there's a bias towards kind of both of those things. So for instance, most of our titles related to Rwanda are related to the genocide. Most of our titles about Somalia are related to the Civil War and the US intervention and Black Hawk Down and all of those things. Those are important stories to tell, but those obviously aren't the only stories that need to be told about these countries. It's similar to, a Jewish studies collection will not just be about the Holocaust. An African American history collection will not just be slavery and the civil rights movement. Those are very important stories, but those can't be the only stories that we allow people to tell. The biggest print implication is that this material is actually used. Specifically our African published African studies material is one of the few areas in the University of Virginia print collection that is bucking the trend of just downward spiral of print circulation. When we look at ebook usage for African studies from Western or European and American publishers, we see the same ebook trends that we see everywhere else of increasing usage. When we look at print, the only place where print is doing strong is in this own voices literature from the developing world. There's also some broader library implications for the profession. So digging through the LC classification schedules and the subject headings, this will be no surprise to anybody who's a cataloger, but there's a lot of problematic stuff there. And there's a real bias in the way that those are organized and described. And I was telling the catalogers at UVA this, talking through this project, and they started laughing. They're like, of course, like, how did you not know that? There's also a really high level of imbalance in the description for places around the world. So if you're looking for history or politics, you can generally find the LC classification schedules will break down to every country in the world, often to like larger cities within those countries. But if you're looking at other areas like economics or development or military science or other areas, you can find information on America, you can find information on Western Europe. If there's even an entry for Africa or Asia or Oceania or anywhere else, it might just be at that top continent level. If you want information at the country level, it might exist. It will just be classified at some random place because they don't have a dedicated section for that area. After we looked at African studies, we thought, oh, let's expand this out because we also have some expansions coming in East Asia, in the Middle East, in South Asia. And so let's take this same framework, rerun the same LC classes for those other geographic areas, and it turns out there's no consistency in how LC deals with that. So Myanmar, sometimes it's in South Asia, sometimes it's in Southeast Asia. Afghanistan, sometimes it's in South Asia, sometimes it's in Central Asia. The Middle East, are we counting Morocco across to Egypt, which is North Africa? Are we counting that as part of the Middle East because it's culturally similar, but LC has them all completely different places in their catalog, so it's really difficult to
expand this to other geographic areas. And finally, as a non-cataloger, like one thing that would have made this would have incredibly simplified this process was if we had authorized place of publication or country of publication. So, we have authorized forms of subject headings, we have authorized forms of authorship, just to keep everything consistent. In our data set, we had these 8 different ways that the city of Cairo was represented, depending on the language and the language of publication and place of publication. And that even only includes the places that put Cairo. Sometimes they would put this particular street in Cairo or this particular neighborhood within Cairo. So we actually ended up having dozens of variations of the way that you could describe Cairo, versus if there was just an authorized country of publication, we could just say, Egypt, which would then of course let me go in and query the catalog, show me everything with the place of publication of Egypt, regardless of what its subject characteristics are. So we'd actually get information about what was published in a region rather than just what was published about that region. So limitations of doing this framework either at your institution or for us doing this more broadly at UVA, there's just a massive investment of time to identify all the LC classes. I actually got an email from LC saying, we noticed a lot of usage on classification web and we think somebody there doesn't know what they're doing. And I said, yes, you are correct. And so, again, we can only identify titles published about a given region geographically, but we can't identify, without a lot of grunt work at the moment, everything that was just published in that region, regardless of its subject. And then finally, this is only one variable in the vast world of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we couldn't necessarily use this to identify LGBT content or religious minority content or gender or other factors like that. So, but it did give us a good starting place and gives us kind of some exciting places to move and change. So I'm gonna go sit down, but Roxanne and I would love to take whatever questions you guys have. Thank you.
Hi, it works. Okay. Thanks for this amazing presentation. I've also, we are looking at doing a diversity audit of our leisure reading collection, which is super, not easy, it's a lot of work, but it's obvious what to do because it's basically a public library collection. But the massive scholarly collection, it's really hard to translate the own voices phenomenon into our world. So I appreciate that other people are grappling with that. I'm just wondering, Tim, if you, did you guys bandy around how to measure domestic own voices? That's a stupid way to put it. Like own voices groups or marginalized groups or communities inside the place of publication known as the United States.
Yeah, so that's something we're trying to figure out how to do now, because again, one of the other new initiatives in addition to Africa at UVA is Indigenous Studies, and at UVA that means both Native Americans and also Aboriginal Australians are kind of the 2 main focus areas. At least with this this framework going by place of publication, there's no way for us to really effectively do that because within the United States, just the incredible socioeconomic and cultural diversity, and there's no way to pin down if you're publishing on Native American studies, you're going to be publishing here, and you're likely this type of scholar. We haven't figured that one out yet.
UVA study, I'm curious if you're going to publish one or more articles so that those of us who might be interested in using or adapting your methodology would have the ability to do that.
Sure, yeah, if I can find somebody to publish it, I'd be happy to. But I'm also happy to work just one-on-one with folks if you want to shoot emails. I love collaborating with people. So.
Put it up on a website, we could all have access.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think all the slides are supposed to go up somewhere on the conferences. So.
So our library is also kind of grappling with the same thing, so this is very useful what you're saying. I'm wondering though, what did you kind of kick around any other factors to use before you kind of settled on geographic publishing perspectives? Like, you know, because I think there's a lot of problems with it. It's a good starting spot. There's a lot of problems with it. It doesn't really address domestic, as you said. So I'm curious as to kind of, were there other things that you kind of bandied about that were not decided upon basically because of a lack of definable strategy that could be figured out, or things that you're looking into, moving into, or things like that, kind of pre and post to this, where you're looking at going, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so we had started off, so the genesis for this came, the whole collection development team took a library webinar series this summer about conducting a diversity audit of your collection, and a lot of that, like I mentioned, a lot of those people came from the public library sphere, and they had, you know, those extensive biographical sources for all of their authors, and we pretty quickly, we started looking a little bit at that, and we quickly found, just given the scope of our collection, it's just, like I said, that really wasn't an option for us here. So we looked at both publisher and place of publication, and it turns out, at least when we're going through the African Studies data, there ended up being a lot of overlap between those. So, you know, if you're Oxford University Press, you're going to show up several different places around the world. You're going to show up show up under New York, under London, under Cape Town, versus if you're publishing in Kinshasa, like you're going to be, you know, the University of Kinshasa, or you're going to be a very hyper-local publisher, an independent publisher. So we found that actually at the end of the day, there was, you know, there's a lot more overlap between those two, and as non-standardized as place of publication was, it was a whole lot better than when we were trying to go through and standardize publisher. So, but in terms of next steps, I think once we identified kind of smaller parts of the collection to look at, you know, I mentioned we looked a little bit at publishers, we started looking a little bit at authors, and you know, if we limited it down to, let's say, just the, you know, several hundred books we have on, you know, the history of Kenya or the history of Ethiopia, then at that point it starts becoming more scalable, actually just brute force, go find information about the actual author rather than just relying on this proxy. So I think this is good, as you said, as a first step to try to identify what are areas of broad interest, and then we can go to more, you know, more traditional but more intensive forms of trying to find out specifically about the author, doing it that way.
Do you think that your work may eventually lead to either because the print circulation in general is generally decreasing? Do you think this work would either lead to weeding of potentially non-own voices content and/or purchasing more own voices content, especially in some of those gap areas that you mentioned?
Yeah, so this actually tied in well with a bunch of other conversations that my boss and I have been having about our collection as we're trying to expand our collection development more globally. Is that, you know, all these, you know, major university presses in the Americas, major publishers in you know, Western Europe and the Americas, we feel really confident we can get those whenever we want. And there are some other things with just our local situation at UVA. We're getting ready to renovate. We're not going to have really much room or capacity to do a whole lot of physical collection development. Can we start transferring a lot of that stuff to, you know, a lot of the major American, Western European publishers to ebooks, which we know are used, freeing up a little bit of money, but more importantly, a lot of staff time to pursue, you know, African collections, to pursue South Asian collections, to pursue those Indigenous Studies collections to support UVA. And that's really where I think we're going to be heading, is to either
forego or to acquire digitally a lot of that traditional content that our faculty have gotten used to, and instead getting that own voices content, getting that underrepresented content, getting that marginalized content. And frankly, the reason we haven't done that is just our campus scholarly culture is so conservative at UVA. Like if we weren't buying Cambridge and Oxford and everybody else in print, there would just be massive problems. Now, our library's getting renovated and we're not gonna have really a print collection for the next several years, so that may provide us with good cover to go ahead and do that. And you know, we don't have a library anyway, so you can't really complain when we don't buy these print books that you tell us time and again are so important to you, but we can never actually see you using.
I have a question for Roxanne. I'm interested in how your library is going to continue to work with instructional faculty to purchase diverse collections. What are your next steps?
I was unprepared for that question, so that's a good thing to think about. Do you have thoughts, suggestions? Anyone else? Because I guess I've done a lot of kind of the work on this project, but in terms of like where to go next or how to communicate that, and I mean, just because my project is user-centered and sort of assessment to communicate value, that doesn't negate the importance of the work Tim's doing and how that relates to our collections. And like you said, continue to work with instructors. So do you have thoughts?
I really don't. I was kind of wondering if any of your faculty, have approached you. I mean, based on your survey, did you have any faculty really connect with you and say, can I work with a library, or were they kind of just answering the surveys?
I don't remember. I did this work back in the spring, and so I don't remember any, outspoken, yes, let's work together, but I do plan to approach our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning because they want to do some training related to EDI and specifically with videos. And because I administer streaming video, I thought, well, that's a natural partnership there. So that might be an approach I take because they kind of access to the faculty in terms of professional development and even working, with instructional designers. I guess that's kind of the method I would take right now in a very vague, unthought of manner until now. Please.
My thoughts on your next steps is I'd be interested I missed the slide where you looked at like how you defined the EDI universe that you were analyzing, but it would be interesting to see how the materials break down by community. Like, are these LGBT focused titles? Are these African American or Black focused titles, etc.? I'd be interested to see that. Just make that your next step. Also, I appreciate you going through this exercise where we're working to push a high-level learning objective around the indigenization of our content, of our course content at my institution. So I will probably have to go through this same exercise. I'm curious, do you guys have a faculty association at your institution? Like, we could not push through a giant change to the tenure and promotion process at our institution, but it sounds like you did.
Wisconsin's faculty associations have been weakened by our legislature and former governor. So there is one, but it's not a formal union.
So they were able to push through that change.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it wasn't without controversy on our campus and some outspoken, but I mean, for some it was a way to recognize invisible labor and it was a way for our campus to put some values into action. That's my perspective on it. So yeah, I actually I was there when it was implemented, but the stuff leading up to it, I wasn't at the University of Wisconsin-Eau, so I wasn't privy to all of those. But
well, anyway, it's a good mechanism to really mobilize EDI efforts.
Yeah. I've heard mixed results from our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning in terms of people who have been attending the EDI trainings. It's either kind of gung-ho or some just not at all. But it's not just, contributions aren't demonstrated only through to the trainings. It's, it can be scholarly activity and teaching and, yeah.
This question is for Tim. So you did all this work to pull out this information about voices in this particular collection. How are you going to then highlight it so that your users can more easily identify these resources?
Yeah, so in the context of our library renovation, we're completely redoing how we're doing our new bookshelf. So up until now, you come inside the main entrance to our library, here are all the new books, or not all, but here's a selection of our new books. Well, it turns out the way that list has always been created is we go through, or someone from the Stacks team goes through the new arrivals from our Coots approval plan, so American publishers, and pulls out things that to them look interesting or look like they might be interesting to other people. And so we're having to completely redo the new bookshelf anyway because our library is going away. So we're looking at, let's pull from a lot more places than just these American publishers. So we have stuff coming on approval from all over the world. We have stuff coming as firm orders from all over the world. Let's maybe have the collection team actually be the people stewarding this new book collection, being rather than just as they're being shelved, oh, this looks interesting, let's maybe just shelve this over here instead. So we want to have, we want to kind of take that work back and have it be done by people who are kind of in the mindset of how do we improve the visibility of these collections. And sorry.
No, it's fine. The reason I was asking is if you were going to pull some of that information and start faceting it in your catalog, like using, I'm also a cataloger as well as acquisition, so the 385 audience characteristics and 386 creator characteristic fields, where then they can, once they search for African studies, they can find by author who is self-identifies as like African American. So,
so again, in the context of this renovation, we're completely rewriting our catalog, our OPAC. So I know that's one of the things that we've kicked around, or the Virgo, our catalog, their team has kicked around for years, is like, to what extent do we have customizable description either from the library side or from the user side? Also related to cataloging, one thing I found from this project is, so one of the slides, there was an unknown, like we have no idea where this book was published. That actually started at about 10% of the collection, and I kind of went through just during meetings and other things and whittled that down to the small percentages now. Almost every one of those unknowns was published in Africa. And the records for those titles published in Africa versus the ones from the major North American presses, there were just a lot more issues with them generally, just in terms of being good catalog records, being complete, having complete description of them. So I think even with the data that we're starting with, like we're kind of already starting in a hole with being able to identify and make visible these collections, which I think is another pretty big problem that the profession more broadly would need to deal with. Because even if we could go through and highlight everything from the University of Virginia, that doesn't help, Wisconsin-Eau Claire when they try to do the exact same thing, because they're starting from square one. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it.